Yeah, I was asked if I could just make a little bit of a discussion around the case for collaborative contracting and collaborative approaches. Before I get into the slide deck, I may be, well, first of all, I'll do the legal thing, so I have to put this up. On one hand, I'm representing some views from Michelle, although a lot of what I'll mention is actually born from my own personal experience as well. I'll just leave that up there for a second. But yeah, actually, I was fortunate, I already touched on it in the discussion early in my career. I worked on brownfield projects in a large oil refinery in the UK. And I was fortunate there to work with a number of people who went on to be quite influential in the industry and also across Shell. So Jay, you know well, and I've met in this call. And I both worked for a gentleman called Nick Smallwood, who was Shell's chief project engineer until a year or two ago, and he's now the chief projects officer for the UK government. I remember very well a couple of guidance he gave me when I started as a young project engineer in terms of managing successful projects in the oil and gas industry. He said, make sure you manage HSE. It's a core value, but also if your HSE performance is not going well, then the project's not going well, and you'll have a train wreck. So, good HSE is good project management. And then the second advice was ensure your contractor or contractors are successful. Yeah, so understand them, get to know them, work closely with them, and support them to be a success. That doesn't mean to say you don't challenge them, you don't provide tough constructive feedback, but basically work with them to be a success. And their success will then be the project success. As typically in oil and gas projects, they will do 80 to 90% of the spending on the project, and I guess that stuck with me early in those first couple of years of my career, and I've tried to kind of maintain that throughout. Whenever I've been working with wider suppliers, so I think and that's something that you'll see come through in the presentation. So, in the oil and gas industry, but I think maybe relevant for widest industry, why is it we would want to do anything different to what we've done before? I think Michael Debrell will touch on it tomorrow. I'm sure John Fotherby from ECI will as well. But on the first slide there, it's quite a well-known graph, I think, from McKinsey, but published in The Economist. That construction productivity has really flatlined. Whether it's oil and gas or wider construction industry, we don't see that productivity changing, and if anything, it's worsening. So there's something we're not doing in the way in which we are operating that is not helping us to improve over time. Obviously, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a lot of challenges. Obviously COVID, but the wider oil price, although we're seeing a little bit of a rebound now, but that really puts pressure on available capital. And in the last few months and year, you can obviously see that the energy transition is putting a further challenge. Within the oil and gas industry, our major suppliers are struggling. This is a little bit, it's not precise, but it's a bit indicative. The major indices continue to grow positively, but the share prices of the major suppliers are weakening, and you see major industrial players moving away from taking on any kind of fixed price or lump sum risk. Examples very recently would be the likes of Kellogg Brown and Root and Fluor. They'll still do it in some cases, but it's very limited and clearly not their preferred mode moving forward. So that means all forms of contract are required to be explored, and that improvement, we believe, requires collaboration. And if you just see this diagram here, about the contribution of the supply chain to successful project delivery. You'll see either the amount of people or the amount of exposure is all very significant. And when it comes to new technology, new developments, we also have to play a part as the operator. So if you add all that up, if you really want to make a difference and an impact in a challenging wider macroeconomic environment with changing societal requirements and pressures, then working together rather than, shall we say, fighting is maybe a key element of future success. What I've also observed, and this maybe happened also back in the late 90s. I'll touch on an example or two project later. But when the first alliancing came around, and then maybe I should add, in that early stage of my career, I was lucky enough to be involved in the first alliance contract in the UK, working on brownfield petrochemical industry. And then it kind of waned maybe around the 2000s. But now I'm seeing across industry quite a convergence around what you might call collaborative or relational contracting, and I'll touch on some of the elements of that as we go through. Obviously, this summit is at the centre, but there's a couple of other recent engagements. I joined one recently with a group called World Commerce and Contracting, which is all industries looking at methods of contracting, and it was fascinating. Even they had the chairman of Pfizer BioNTech, of BioNTech of Pfizer BioNTech, who helped drive the vaccine development, on talking about the approach. In the top right is the UK Association of Project Management, looking at collaborative contracting. The same summit had relational contracts, and then I won't steal the thunder of Tony Mapleson from ECITB and John Fotherby from ECI, but they'll speak tomorrow about the work they're doing. But you see, whether it's industry associations or wider commercial associations, there's an upswell of interest in these approaches, probably driven by the previous slide on the case for change. And I think one of the aspects that kind of maybe is underpinning that is there's a bit of a merging, I would say, traditional and more modern approaches, and things like continuous improvement and agile are starting to embed a lot, which I think supports some of the collaborative aspects. So this is I'm pretty sure, John, it was from one of our ECI sessions we had, a similar kind of a webcast last year, and I think this is what the group that joined there felt was the benefits and the aspects of collaborative contracting, and you can see there that driving value, managing risk, increasing productivity. Focus on safety, mitigation, sharing, focusing on outcomes. There's a lot of resonance there. So that was just kind of a snapshot, and say some perspectives from European industry on what could come as a result of collaborative contracting. So I should say at this point, and I'll touch on it later. We're within Shell, this is not like a de facto approach. We still use traditional contract forms like EPC lump sum or EPCM, where the risks and the value aspects drive you that way, as we discussed in some of the Q&A. But we are now looking to kind of explore the methods and the benefits of such an approach, and understand in what context it would be best to use. And we're still very much on a journey of understanding, which is also part of being involved in summits like this, to get a broader understanding of experience and tactics to help make it a successful part of the contract strategy mix. So in terms of developing collaboration, it's not really something you can mandate, although we will talk later about relational contracts and contractually required behaviours. But communication, coordination, and cooperation together won't necessarily deliver collaboration. It's almost a state of being where you really embrace the one team, one shared vision, and one collective project delivery group, which really depends on trust, honesty, and openness, and focusing on a no blame approach. And it's best, as I mentioned a couple of times throughout the session, it seems to be best developed where it's organic and where trust over time matures. Of course, you have to give opportunity for the trust to grow and develop, but when that trusting environment is created, it becomes very, very powerful. And some of those preconditions to developing that environment, I'll talk about later. And I think also the benefit of this, and I'll kind of summarise it at the end, is that by such an approach, it can still apply regardless of the contract form or the remuneration model. It may mean that the benefits are not, equally shared. So if you develop this approach in a lump sum or a fixed price approach, then maybe the company doesn't benefit from all the savings, but it still gets a very successful project. It still comes in hopefully well under the bid price, and the contractor's happy and the company should be happy. So this kind of approach need not be confined to reimbursable and incentive type contracts, but really they're building this trust and partnership approach to support a successful outcome. Obviously, more incentivized approaches means you can share the benefits, but it doesn't negate it for a different form. So this just shows a little bit how trust and commitment can develop. And yes, communication helps, but that doesn't go anywhere unless you start to do something with it. So you kind of coordinate and you make sure that things get planned in sequence and they support. But actually, starts to get better when you can cooperate, when perhaps someone is anticipating your issues on your behalf and kind of suggest to you, maybe you go first, or this needs to be done before I can do mine, and how can we work together to plan and maybe level our resources. But then collaboration really starts to kick in when, for example, you see if you've got a broader alliance, and one supplier or contractor is not able to complete a task or has some challenges, one of the other partners steps in and actually executes the work or provides the support. So it's really moving from the simple passing of information to the interactive and agile interdependency between all the parties, because they all share in value and the outcome. And I think what's the case for collaboration from a personal perspective? It's not particularly nice to be in an adversarial and highly transactional and contractual relationship. It's actually fun, working together, getting energy from driving performance and driving solutions. So purely from a kind of a human perspective, I think collaboration much more fun, much more energizing and rewarding. And I would think most people would have a similar view. But when does it happen? It had a lot of reflection on this, and I think John Fotherby, we talked about this in a recent meeting. It seems that a good crisis always brings collaboration. It's that transcendent objective that aligns everyone, and it basically goes above any individual interest. And there's quite a number of historic examples when, in the face of a schedule-driven crisis, operators and contractors work together to deliver exceptional results. You go back to the Second World War, and in Europe, the Normandy landings. It would be the same in the South Pacific. They recently, the setting up of in the UK, the so-called Nightingale hospitals, where they converted conference centres to 3,000-4,000 bed hospitals in the case of a week or two. I mean, I'm sure there are many similar examples in the US, and I think there was a famous one in China. The vaccines, obviously, that's just been a tremendous achievement, and cut years off the development of vaccines, and so far, I think they seem to be both safe and effective, and I think when I heard the presentation from the CEO of BioNTech, it was amazing how limited contractual basis there was to the relationship that actually allowed that to happen. And then even, maybe a funny one, but Apollo 13, when you look at how everyone worked together when all the issues, I mean, it's a good movie, but, it's amazing that movie is based on fact. And, there's time pressure and lots of different departments. They all come together and all bring a little bit of their own creativity into how to solve solutions under pressure. Particularly in the oil and gas industry, there's a move developing by the international oil and gas producers called Joint Industry Project 33, which is looking at standardization of specifications across industry. Would that have happened if we hadn't had the oil price crash in 2014, where there was a real call to arms to the energy industry to reduce its cost base? And do we also see that certain contractors are only opening up to, say, collaborative or reimbursable contracts because of existential threats? Some of them have had very serious financial issues, and that crisis of their own financial and operational robustness is forcing them to think differently. So, I think underpinning this is there an opportunity that we can kind of embed the crisis mentality in everyday working, and use that to kind of drive strong alignment between all the various parties to deliver exceptional outcomes. And so this item about alignment of interest, we'll come back, but it is interesting when you look at the great examples that a good crisis always seems to stimulate these strong behaviours. So I talked earlier about the preconditions to success, and there are a few different models around. So I've got 2 or 3 on the screen here at the moment. So there's the one on the top right from World Commerce and Contracting on the 9 principles of relational contracting. There's a little bit more depth behind that. I mean, I've got a backup slide that I'll put in the pack to share afterwards. But they have the principles, but then they have 6 norms or behaviours that they see as underpinning that, so that almost the blue box is the structure, and the red words on the left are kind of the behaviours. So they talk about reciprocity, so treat each other equally, about autonomy, giving freedom of action, honesty, not hiding anything, being open across the whole supply chain, working on it, and that building on integrity, so treating everyone fair and equally, and also loyalty, so supporting everyone and ensuring that everyone gets an equitable share of the benefits, and really driving on those to kind of inspire the behaviours, and the environment that then leads to trust. I did a kind of distillation of a wide range of research across industry, and we'll put some of those links in the pack we'll share. But many of the major consultants, the McKinseys, the Bostons, the Turner and Townsends, etc., have all written papers on this type of approach. And we talked already about early continuous involvement, having a joint approach rather than a unilateral approach, sharing of risk and reward, aligning on targets, and looking at how you can reduce liability. And we touched a little bit, I think it was mentioned about the CII Operating System 2 approach, that they're doing some really interesting work on the benefits of pooling risk, and also a really good understanding of who can bear risk. And I think that's also something that tends to skew the relationship when too much risk is pushed on one party. Even if it's contractually binding, if their balance sheet, or the competence profile is not capable of managing the risk, you're going to end up with a bad outcome regardless, and maybe with a challenge to recover any of the losses. And it'd be far more positive to have all the parties working together, and those who are able to bear the risk or manage the risk, taking the majority of the support and the decisions. So I think if you're looking at relational or collaborative contracting, don't focus on the deal, the numbers. Focus on the relationship and the partnership you want to develop, and the outcomes you're seeking to achieve. Yeah, and look at what's the way in which you want to behave together. What's the social norms or the behaviours that you want in your collective team. And then how can you mitigate and avoid risk through that team working and an understanding and alignment of interest, and have a framework that's kind of fair and flexible and adaptable to the circumstance, and supported by the building of trust. And I think it's just, as I mentioned earlier, it's much more energizing to have an approach where you're working on solutions together, rather than trading legal letters or red lines or claims, and you end up fighting together. It's funny. Someone else, I think, in one of the other summits, made the comment that although there's lots of fights, how often does it actually end up in court or arbitration? Don't have a huge amount of statistics on that, but the anecdotal evidence was not very often. So there's a lot of energy and effort wasted that ultimately parties manage to find the means to settle. And actually, that kind of energy might be better spent inspiring solutions and prevention of issues than so we say, fighting afterwards. So I think relationships and building trust is really key. And I said, when you've been in that kind of approach, it's the sort of thing you want to go back and do time and time again. Just going into more of the economics of it, and around shall we say, the forms of contract. We've touched a little bit about this, but there's a bit of a paradigm, that says lump sum contracting, fixed price contracting is the maximum price you would pay. And there's a lot of debate and a lot of research around this, but that's certainly the behaviour you see when there's a lot of project financing involved, that the financing parties believe that there is security in such a contract. But what you see is typically that a company that's bidding on a lump sum basis will do their risk modelling, and they'll typically try and bid something around a P70 probability, and then they'll try and beat that and get a P50 or below in order to make the profit. They may do that by really minimising on the engineering and procurement hours, and that's where you get into the risks of not having the AWP aspect set up. They may go for the absolute minimum specification in terms of equipment that meets the spec, yeah, rather than an optimum quality. And they may seek to drive procurement savings via economies of scale with their own supply chain, and really pass down some of that cost challenge to subcontractors, and potentially go for low cost support staff, and then, as I mentioned, potentially then look to increase the contract value and the margin by putting in claims and getting into this kind of potentially adversarial relationship. But what it means is the absolute minimum that you're going to get the project at is P70. Hopefully they'll do well and they'll deliver it below P70, and they'll make a profit, and there won't be many issues. but on the basis of claims and potential challenges and issues, it's not impossible that the P70 increases, yeah, over time on the project. A potential alternative is that you go for a more open book approach, and you ensure that you're willing to pay all genuine and justifiable costs, and that puts an element of trust that people will not go and spend money for the sake of it, and they will spend money on productive work. You offer a minimum and fixed fee for good performance. So if you meet the plan, you'll make a 5 or 10% margin, and there's a potential to increase that fee by beating the plan, with great KPI performance. And potentially you could do a softer KPIs on the right behaviours with some kind of peer review, objective evidence across all the different parties, how people perform. And a more modern way of doing that is it could be anonymized and done with things like blockchain, etc., in real time, so that you've almost you've got the kind of trust advisor or Amazon review type approach amongst the peers. And potentially a company could look to protect a significant part of the downside risk, particularly if at the end of the day it's such a big blowout that they're going to have to come back to company anyway. So it doesn't make sense that there's a big contingency priced into the bid if they're not going to be able to manage it. And similarly, the risk is not trapped inside a lump sum, but you leave that as a flexible pot for all parties that are in the supply chain to draw down to. And then if things go well, then more similar projects occur. And there would be a minimum fee, at least for repeat projects, to encourage the good performance on one to secure future work. And what this does is it doesn't guarantee you're going to get better than the P70, but what it does do is provide the opportunity to beat it. So you could still have something in a P80 or whatever, depending on the risk profile, the challenges. But there is definitely, with such an approach, the opportunity to improve productivity, to learn from one project to the next, to drive better solutions, more effective by building trust and working solutions together, and therefore that possibility to improve together exists. Whereas with a more transactional lump sum approach, it does potentially give security. It does maybe secure financing for projects that are well boxed in, well managed from an interface perspective, with a well understood scope, a well understood supply chain. It can still be appropriate, but it still, unless you've then got a very competitive and sharp tendering, you may not get the most competitive outcome. And depending on how tight you bid it, you may end up pushing too much risk. But I think hopefully the points elaborated that the one in green gives you the opportunity to grab more value. And on the right, there is another approach called integrated project insurance, which kind of says there's a bunch of waste in how we tender, and actually can we move to that waste being removed from the tendering and co-insured. So actually all parties would take out a form of insurance to cover overruns, and that may be paid by company, or it could be by a whole alliance group. But in essence, the aim is to remove waste in the process, and that's certainly one of the big focuses of the CII OS2 research. Where they estimate there could be as much as 40% of wasted effort by multiple transactional relationships throughout the supply chain. So hopefully it just shows that there is a potential for a cost and performance upside by this kind of approach. It's not to say, as I said, that the lump sum can't still work. I'm just saying that there's potentially more upside with a different approach. Within Shell, we have an improvement program for contracting that we call focused contracting, and we have 5 key levers. I just wanted to elaborate a little bit the areas that I think are relevant for collaboration that we see as adding value to our future projects, particularly in the contracting space. So the first lever is early involvement of the market and project shaping, and we touched on that earlier about the involvement of contractors and engagement with contractors early in the contract strategy setting process. So we would look to have more structured involvement of contractors prior to fail three or the select decision gate. Looking to integrate market standard solutions and getting strong contractor input on how to deliver a scope with high productivity, either via fabrication or site construction. Increasingly, we look for standardised use of fabrication yards, either globally or regionally, where we can build a partnership over time with yards that we have frame agreements, and then learn and grow together on how to make efficient construction. So another good example of collaboration. And then collaboration with the wider supply chain in terms of supplier and subcontractor integration. So working with our major suppliers and OEMs to align on common supply chains and identifying where we can maximise procurement leverage. And also in countries where there's a strong in-country value or local content aspect, and I think Keith mentioned earlier, that might be one area you need to adapt your contract strategies for. How can we work together to develop local suppliers successfully, and particularly moving forward, the whole carbon management and greenhouse gas footprint improvement. I think on the fourth one on models, that's essentially what we're talking about here. But looking at what suits the market, how to optimize risk, and getting the repeat benefit. And then we specifically call out longer term collaboration. So we have a team focused on continuous improvement and agile that we bring in to consult with both our project teams and our major suppliers in order to drive collaborative behaviour. And I'll give a small example of a couple of those projects later. But really looking to build long-term partnership with similar suppliers over multiple scopes, and that's that kind of right-hand side of the spectrum that Richard mentioned earlier, where we look to build and establish long-term strategic relationships and build that trust, at a corporate level as well as at a project level. But here's just some of the examples we've done recently. As I mentioned earlier, this is not like a given. This is not a must-do in Shell, but we are exploring it in a few different areas. I won't go into too much detail on the first one in the top left on Brent, because Tony may mention that, but that's an area where we work closely with the Project Collaboration Toolkit, and we saw significant savings from repeat projects, working with a very similar supply chain and a very collaborative context. And you can see a bit of the learning curve in the graph in the bottom, and the piece of paper is the behavioural charter signed between all the parties with a bit of commitment to how they want to work together. And it was very much a best person for the job, so that you can't really see it in the picture, but that's that's kind of say the core leadership team. And you can see them all holding up the labels of the company logo, and I think if you squint at it, you'll see that there's not many logos that are the same. So it's a real team effort. We have a joint venture in Iraq called the Basra Gas Company, where we work closely with the Iraqi state oil company, and we worked with Wood, one of the oil and gas engineering and procurement services suppliers. And by deploying a highly collaborative approach between, shall we say, the Basra Gas engineering team and the supplier, focusing on areas of improvement, we managed to improve the processing time of procurement by a factor of 4. But there was contingent benefit of that in terms of the atmosphere in the office, the energy for the team, the overall general team spirit and environment, by delivering improvement that just really energised and allowed them to pick up on a very aggressive expansion program very quickly. So it's a relatively small example, but it was very powerful in terms of the relationship between the two organisations. Within the Gulf of Mexico, we have a structured approach to our subsea contracts, and we do structured design competitions with 3 or 4 selected suppliers, and we use that to get supplier insight and supplier-led designs into the project conception, and looking at the best approach to both design and execute the contract. And we do that under structured competition, but in a very transparent way. There's a lot of feedback to all the suppliers throughout the process, and we also try to have a fair distribution of work and effort across the teams. So I think that's another good example. And in terms of benchmarks, this shows up extremely well, and then we get a lot of good feedback from the suppliers that they feel engaged and feel that they can contribute with their own insights and experience, not just be, so we say, dictated to by the owner. And the last two kind of touch on one similar project and another recent project in the US. We've developed a long-term relationship with Worley for our downstream projects. So they are, and not all, but many of our global downstream refinery and chemical sites, they are a site contractor doing engineering procurement services. Over a course of 2 or 3 projects in the Netherlands, we worked with it was initially a Jacobs team that then became part of Worley, and we worked on an agile-led delivery with continuous improvement and a very integrated team between Shell and Worley. They're now approaching the investment phase of the project, and they've managed to deliver that phase in probably half the time than typical benchmarks through a very collaborative approach and a very facilitated kind of overlay of agile on a traditional waterfall approach. And this is something we're now seeing kind of catching on across global. But it is important that you've got the right mix in the team, and it is an interesting one when you go to new areas and locations, whether you can replicate the same behaviours if you've got different personnel. So, underpinning that, it has been that there's been a common team on both Shell and the contractor side. And it may be, red to green applied it, and we also did it on another project. We've used what we call either a collaborative tendering or an agile tendering approach, where we go out with a very high level spec of what we want to achieve, sometimes with a clear target, saying we have to achieve this cost or this schedule. This is kind of the objective of the project. Let's iterate on what are the successful approaches that could help us to deliver this. And we sometimes do it with maybe 4 or 5 suppliers, and then narrow down to 2 or 3 for more detailed collaboration. And this, in the case of the Lake Charles LNG project, which is a multi-billion-dollar development, this included, going through, almost line by line, all the risk areas and saying, if we want to achieve this target, should you take the risk for us? What's the exposure? How do we best manage it? And then how do we capture that contractually? And it led to a very empowering discussion around what was the best way to approach the scope and to deliver a competitive outcome that would give the project every chance of being approved. Now, the sad thing is that Shell kind of withdrew from that project as one of the challenges of COVID and low oil price. But I think we've left a legacy where the remaining developers still have a good chance of being able to take that project forward and making it investable. So these are just a few of the areas that we're exploring, but we're very much at the start of the journey. This is only 3 or 4 examples, and we do many hundreds of projects a year. 2 other examples before I then just move to a brief summary. These are ones in the UK. Obviously, I'm British, and that's a lot of my reference sources. I'm sure there are others that you're aware of, but these are quite famous ones, I think, at least in this part of the world. Um, in the late 90s, there was the BP Andrew development, which really pioneered the pay and share, gain share, and the collaborative alliance approach. And they came in 6 months ahead of schedule and 80 million under budget by really driving this integrated best person for the job, empowered team, and shared risk and reward. And then on the left-hand side is the Heathrow Terminal 5 project, where very strong leadership from Sir John Egan, who really drove to build I'll sort of say a hugely integrated team across a range of suppliers who had all been working to a greater or lesser extent in the Heathrow area, so understood the environment, and then looked to see how the risk apportionment and the removal of that risk apportionment and being held, so we say, at the corporate level could really inspire and enable constructive solution orientation from the suppliers, and indeed looking at swapping scopes between suppliers if they found that one was better to do it than another, and driving a strong approach. And it's very much in this cost plus incentive with a limited downside risk approach. And yeah, it's seen by many parties as a very successful infrastructure project development. There are, I'm sure, many more, but and I've put links to these. They'll go in the information afterwards. But this is just a couple of examples from history, and maybe we're relearning that. So I just want to kind of finalise with one last slide. What really is the case for collaborative contracting? So we seem to do it naturally when there's a crisis, yeah, and when we do so, exceptional things happen. So how can we make that exceptional situation recreate in normal business, yeah? And is there a way in which we can really drive that and provide excitement and energization? I believe it provides an opportunity to drive overall costs lower, not necessarily by squeezing margins, but by improving performance, reducing cost, increasing uptime, and then sharing in the rewards. The underlying principles, however, transcend the contract form. So it's driven by behaviours, trust, and transparency, and that can lead to successful outcomes regardless of the contract form. The difference, as I mentioned earlier, is that maybe there's not an equitable sharing of the reward, but it shouldn't mean you don't want to do it. If you have to do a lump sum, then you want that lump sum to be a success. So why not do it, even if you have a lump sum, in order to help your contractual partner to be as successful as possible. And how many times do we have to invoke the contract and go legal and into arbitration? Wouldn't it be better to have clauses that drive us to make things go right rather than worry about what happens when things go wrong? Obviously, gross negligence, blatant and willful misconduct are things we can't tolerate. But outside of that, maybe there's an opportunity. And I must say, this is a bit of an interesting internal debate. We're certainly not at that stage yet, but we're trying to have an internal dialogue to see, where we are collectively comfortable. Noting certainly in our industry and other industries like nuclear and aerospace, the impacts of getting things wrong can be quite challenging. Lastly, the penetration of digital offers many ways to drive, that transparency and that collaboration. It's a new world now, and maybe that didn't exist before, and that creates the opportunity to support this type of behaviour. And then maybe the last one, which is that when you get that great outcome and that great collaboration, it generates energy, it generates performance, and it generates a fantastic relationship, which leads to more work. And I think good work leads to more work, and I think that's what most companies are in business to deliver a product.